So what was studied scientifically in terms of ASD and violence and murder? We see in the first study that they looked at 239 individuals who had murdered at least 3 people. 55% did not seem to have any type of neurological disorder. 28% had definite, highly probable, or possible autism, and 21% had definite or suspected head injury. Now, the numbers work out to over 100% because of the overlap of those last 2 categories. They're not mutually exclusive. Somebody can have autism and have a suspected head injury at the same time. So a possible conclusion we saw that was drawn in that article was a significant proportion of mass or serial killers may have neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism spectrum disorder or head injury. That's a direct quote from the article. Now, it's understandable if somebody takes that quote out of context how that could be upsetting. But again, this quote appeared in an article that had a lot of material covered. Now, the second study examined 75 incidents, specifically murders of the mass type, not the serial type. And they found that 6 of the 75 killers likely had ASD, so 8%. When we know that in the general population, ASD affects less than 1%. So just looking at those numbers really quickly, again without moving deep into the article, it looks like people with ASD are greatly overrepresented among these types of killers. But that's not really what the article found. I mean, those are the numbers, yes, but the information that the article was trying to convey wasn't about some trend about people with ASD and violence. Rather, it was talking about a potential of a small subgroup of individuals with the disorder who were more likely to be serious offenders. The emphasis here was on identifying this very small portion of individuals with ASD, and the article even talked about a suggestion of a new diagnostic subtype being created to help differentiate this subgroup from other people with ASD. And this is referred to as the criminal autistic psychopathy subgroup. The idea here is if these people are identified, they can receive specially developed interventions that would help minimize the risk for violence. One key characteristic of this possible subtype would be a preoccupation with disturbing or violent content. Now, I see kind of what the researchers were getting at in these articles. I think this is certainly interesting, but I would think that a preoccupation with disturbing content would really always be a cause for alarm. When people fantasize about revenge or harming people, society needs to pay attention regardless of the presence or absence of any mental disorder, including ASD. But still, I can appreciate what they were trying to say in this article. They were really focusing on some of the autism spectrum disorder symptoms seen in some of these individuals. If you look at these studies, I think they try to talk about this subject matter in a way that's respectful to people with mental illness. Now, some of the interpretations of these articles kind of have a different spin on them. But if you look at the articles, they made it pretty clear about the limitations of their studies. We see the limitations mentioned were the use of online resources, which may not be valid. Many people with ASD also have other high-risk factors, for example, being traumatized. We see that diagnostic precision is not very high. So when you're looking at somebody else's diagnosis of a third party, you have to keep in mind that in the mental health treatment community, we're not that good at diagnosing, right? We don't diagnose as well as what's seen in other fields, right? If somebody's diagnosing a car that has a mechanical problem, they're going to get that diagnosis right most of the time. When you're diagnosing a human being with a mental disorder, you're not going to get that right most of the time, unfortunately. That's why it's important, I think, to stick with the same counselor for at least some period of time so they can kind of get an understanding of what's going on. Now, looking at the types of murders being studied, this is an important topic. And of course, these murders are awful. But from a statistical point of view, they're rare. So the sample sizes are small. So an important topic, but small sample sizes. So that's something to take into consideration too. We want to be careful how much we infer from very small groups of people. Then there's the whole correlation and causation issue. So if ASD is overrepresented in certain violent populations, that's just a correlation. That doesn't mean that ASD caused the person to commit a crime. It could be that some other factor caused ASD and the criminal behavior. For example, trauma. So When we look at correlation, we have to make sure we don't jump over to causation. We don't know if those variables have a causative effect on one another, or again, if something else caused them. Causation is actually very hard to establish, even with studies that are well done. And these studies, as I mentioned, were fairly limited in their data sources. It wasn't that their methodology was necessarily poor, but the data wasn't very good. So they're not going to be able to infer causation with the level of data and analysis that they had. Now, individuals with ASD are no more likely to commit a crime, including violent crime, than anybody else in the general population. This is what we see from many different research studies. And it's specifically mentioned with these articles as well. In fact, what we see from research literature is that people with ASD may be less likely to commit violent crime. Now, individuals with ASD are 4 to 10 times more likely to be the victim of a crime. But here with ASD, we do know they're less likely to commit a crime and more likely to be a victim. Here's a quote from one of the papers talking about the findings of how people with ASD are not more violent than anyone else. It is crucial that these important findings are stressed in any dissemination of research regarding neurodevelopmental conditions and violent crime in order to avoid stigmatizing an already vulnerable group. So they say it right in this paper. They say in one of these papers that essentially if you're going to interpret these findings, you have to read the whole paper. You have to take it in context. You have to understand that people with ASD are actually at low risk for committing violent crimes. But many who have interpreted these articles did not follow the warning that was right in this one paper. So what's really happening is people who are writing blogs and creating other media around these articles are reading these articles, even though there's no evidence that suggests they're qualified to interpret the results, and even less evidence to suggest they're reading the entire article. And they're picking out sensationalistic information, pulling it out of context, and then reporting their version of it. So I think the frustration is understandable, but it really should be directed at those who are distorting the scientific findings, not at the researchers who are simply studying a topic and reporting what they found. So I mentioned before this is an important topic, right? We do need to study murders and try to understand what leads to them. But what's the truth? What really leads to somebody becoming a serial killer or another type of murderer? Well, there's a genetic component, and brain injury could certainly be something else we see, as well as environmental stressors like trauma and poor parental bonding. Really, adverse childhood experiences in general could be problematic. We believe a lot of these factors come together, right? So maybe no one thing causes it, but all these things come together and really lead somebody in that direction. So in terms of the mental health piece, mental illness doesn't directly contribute to criminality for the most part. But it may be a factor that exacerbates other problems that we see in a person's life. It makes it harder for them to cope with problems at school, at work, family problems, and other relational problems. So a good example would be narcissism and psychopathy. The lack of empathy associated with those personality traits and the corresponding mental disorders combined with stressors, and this could mean that somebody doesn't really know how to calculate when other people are going to be affected by what they do. They're not going to understand the impact of criminal behavior on other people. That's what lack of empathy would really lead to. So they take some sort of violent action because that protective mechanism isn't in place. Now, individuals with ASD often have comorbid depression and anxiety. So, of course, this can reduce one's ability to cope effectively. And we know that people with ASD are more likely to be exposed to bullying. And we know that bullying is a real problem in terms of violent tendencies later on. People that are victims of bullying have difficulty in terms of managing some violent behavior. Not all the time, of course, but the risk is increased for that group. Now, on top of this, we know that people with ASD tend to have more adverse childhood experiences as well. So in the rare instances when somebody with ASD does commit an act of violence, perhaps a major contributing factor is that they were mistreated because of their mental disorder. But in this case, essentially what they really found was a correlation that leads to no definitive causation at all, and that people with ASD are not actually violent. So what was studied scientifically in terms of ASD and violence and murder? We see in the first study that they looked at 239 individuals who had murdered at least 3 people. 55% did not seem to have any type of neurological disorder. 28% had definite, highly probable, or possible autism, and 21% had definite or suspected head injury. Now,
everyone is stupid and insensitive and criminal like yourself. And I just made a post about me hitting my head. And now you're comparing stupid, insensitive and criminal people towards smart and sensitive people with intention to hurt them as much as fucking possible. To protect the worst possible torture of innocent people into all fucking eternity. Hitting my head cannot make me into a stupid and insensitive person. But no, I did not hurt my head, and nothing fucking happened. But you are doing the most amount of warfare towards me.
75 incidents, specifically murders of the mass type, not the serial type.
Oh my fucking god!
Of the 75 killers,
all the criminal people are stupid and insensitive like yourself. When you are using the autism diagnosis to compare stupid and insensitive people towards smart and sensitive people, with intention to hurt these smart and sensitive people as much as fucking possible. And then the stupid and insensitive people are the smart and sensitive people, and vice versa, and you're using that to hurt the smart and sensitive people as much as fucking possible. And those people, which those people are not, is made into those people, which those people are not. And then you are using that to torture these people beyond all fucking limits with medications. And that is why this video is appearing on my For You page on TikTok, because that is what you people are working towards and against.
Help differentiate this subgroup from other people with ASD.
This is so directed towards me. Why? Because you want to torture me as much as fucking possible. I just talked about hitting my head in a post on Facebook. And then you are making me into the most criminal fucking person of this whole entire fucking planet. I cannot pitch my head in order to become a stupid, insensitive, and criminal person. But I get it, everything which you are working towards and against is that torturing innocent people as much as fucking possible. And yeah.
Including ASD. But still,
you are stupid and insensitive. You are criminal.
Some of the autism spectrum disorder symptoms seen in some of these individuals. If you look at these studies, I think they try to talk about.
I cannot become a stupid and insensitive criminal person by hitting my head. But the stupid and insensitive criminal people like yourself is fucking everywhere. And you are attacking the wrong people for the wrong reason with intention to hurt them as much as fucking possible, because that is everything which you are working towards and against. I have been tortured beyond all fucking limits for 36 fucking years. And you are doing everything in your power for that to continue into all fucking eternity. Oh my fucking god, this is beyond all fucking limits, criminal.
Well as what's seen in other fields.
Yeah, so this is what I am talking about when I am saying that the autism diagnosis is more discriminating than fucking anything. They are making innocent people into the most criminal fucking people of the whole entire fucking planet, with intention to hurt them as much as fucking possible, because that is everything which they are working towards and against. After everything which I and these other people have been through, while not serving there for 5 fucking seconds. This is beyond all fucking limits, criminal. Stupid and insensitive people are not smart and sensitive people, and you cannot use this diagnosis to put these two groups in the same category. That is the most discriminating and abusive fucking thing, which this video is a bigger proof of than fucking anything.
That's just a correlation. That doesn't mean that ASD
abusing me per 5
the
fucking
person to
seconds
commit a crime.
can never be
It could be that
excused
some other
because
factor
I never
caused
deserve
ASD
that. I am never
and the
going
criminal
to
behavior.
deserve that. And you
For
are
example,
sitting there
trauma.
wanting to hurt me as much
So,
as fucking possible
when we look at
because that is
correlation,
everything
we
which
have
you
to
are
make sure we
working
don't
towards
jump
and
over
against
to
after
causation.
everything which I have been
We don't
through
know
after
if those
36
variables
fucking
have a
years
causative
with a horrible
effect on one
fucking
another,
life. You
or
are
again,
sitting
something
there
else caused
wanting
them.
to hurt me as
Causation
much
is
as
actually very
fucking
hard to
possible because that is
establish,
everything which
even
you are
with
working
studies that are
towards
well
and
done.
against.
And these
Oh
studies that I
my
mentioned
fucking
were
God.
fairly limited in their data sources. It wasn't that their
The
methodology
criminal
was
people
necessarily
are
poor,
fucking everywhere,
but the
and
data
you could be
wasn't
picking a
very good.
coincidental
So
person
they're
on
not
the
going to be able
fucking
to infer
street, and
causation
you would
with the
be
level of
correct
data
with
and
respect to the
analysis that
fact
they
that
had.
this person is a criminal.
Now, individuals
but you
with
are picking
ASD
this specific
are
person.
no more likely to
Why?
commit
Because
crime,
everything which you people are
including
working
violent
towards
crime,
and against is
than
telling people
anybody
it
else in
does
the general
not deserve
population.
it.
This is what we see from
And
many
because
different
you
research
want to
studies.
protect the
And it's
worst
specifically
possible torture of
mentioned
innocent people
with
into
these
all
articles
fucking
as well.
eternity because you
In
like
fact,
that.
what we see from research literature
And
is that people
because
with
this is
ASD
the
may be
most
less
amount of
likely to commit
evilness and
violent
human
crime.
fucking trafficking.
Now, individuals with ASD are 4 to 10 times more likely to be the victim of a crime. But here, with ASD, we do know they're less likely to commit a crime and more likely to be a victim. Here's a quote from one of the papers talking about the findings of how people with ASD are not more violent than anyone else. It is crucial that these important findings are stressed in any dissemination of research regarding neurodevelopmental conditions and violent crime in order to avoid stigmatizing an already vulnerable group. So they say it right in this paper. They say in one of these papers that essentially if you're going to interpret these findings, you have to read the whole paper. You have to take it in context. You have to understand that people with ASD are actually at low risk
to read
for
the whole
committing
thing. Oh
violent
yeah,
crimes.
because
But many who have interpreted
abusive
these
fucking
articles
person was
did not follow the
attacking me
warning
for
that was
not
right in this one
describing
paper. So what's really happening is
the
people who
smallest
are
little
writing blogs
fucking
and creating
detail
other
of
media
these
around these articles
diagnoses instead of
are
looking
reading
at
these articles,
the
even
whole
though there's no
fucking
evidence
picture
to
and
suggest
how
they're
this
qualified to interpret the
diagnosis
results,
is
and even less
abusing other
evidence to
people.
suggest
It
they're
is
reading the
not
entire article.
necessary to read
And
every
they're picking
fucking
out
detail
sensationalistic
with respect to
information,
how
pulling it out of
retarded
context,
fucking people are
and then reporting
presenting our
their version of
retarded
it.
fucking
So I think the
diagnosis.
frustration is understandable, but it
No.
really should be directed at those
You
who
are
are
missing the whole
distorting
fucking point, and
the
that
scientific
is that
findings.
these abusive
Not the researchers
diagnoses
who are
are more
simply studying a
abusive than
topic and
fucking
reporting
anything.
what they found.
I do
So
not
I mentioned
need
before, this is an
to
important
read every
topic, right? We do
fucking
need to study
detail of
murders
the
and try
people
to
of
understand what
people
leads
which
to them.
does not
But what's the
understand
truth?
anything.
What really leads to somebody
and which
becoming
is
a
coming
serial
up
killer
with these
or
things which
another
is
type of
beyond
murder?
all fucking
Well, there's a
limits
genetic
abusive
component,
because they do
and
not
brain injury
understand
could certainly
anything.
be something else we see, as well as environmental stressors like trauma and poor parental bonding. Really, adverse childhood experiences in general could be problematic. We believe a lot of these factors come together, right? So maybe no one thing causes it, but all these things come together and really lead somebody in that direction. So in terms of the mental health piece, mental illness doesn't directly contribute to criminality for the most part. But it may be a factor that exacerbates other problems that we see in a person's life. It makes it harder for them to cope with problems at school,
No,
at work,
because I
family
understand
problems,
that this is
and
not
other
fucking
relational
necessary
problems.
at any
So a good
fucking point
example
in
would
time
be
because you do not
narcissism and
understand
psychopathy.
anything.
The lack
Why
of
the
empathy
fuck
associated
should I
with those
read it?
personality traits and the corresponding mental
fucking God,
disorders,
and then they're
combined
like
with
taking this
stressors,
card
and this
and
could
they're
mean that
like,
somebody
"You
doesn't
did
really know
not
how
read
to
it.
calculate
You cannot
when
talk
other
about
people
this."
are going to be
Yeah, I
affected
can
by
talk
what
about
they do.
this because I
They're not
understand
going to
that
understand
you
the
do not
impact
understand
of
fucking
criminal
anything, and
behavior
I do
on
not
other
read.
people. That's
I
what
do not
lack of empathy
need
would really
to
lead
read
to.
every fucking
So
word
they
of
take
the
some sort of
paper of
violent
people
action
who does
because
not
that
understand
protective
anything
mechanism
because they
is
do
in
not
place.
understand
Now, individuals
anything,
with
you know?
ASD often
That is
have comorbid
a
depression
waste of
and anxiety.
time.
So, of course, this can
Oh,
reduce
Jesus
one's ability to
fucking
cope
Christ.
effectively. And we know that people with ASD are more likely to be exposed to bullying. And we know that bullying is a real problem in terms of violent tendencies later on. People that are victims of bullying have difficulty in terms of
because
managing
I
some
have
violent
been
behavior.
bullied.
Not all
And
the
then
time, of
you
course,
are
but the
making
risk
me
is
in
increased
to
for
the
that
most
group.
criminal
Now, on
fucking
top of this,
person
we
of
know
this
that people
whole
with
entire
ASD tend to
fucking
have
planet
more
for having
adverse
to handle that.
childhood experiences as
Oh
well.
my fucking
So
God.
in rare instances
No,
when somebody with
stupid
ASD
and
does
insensitive
commit
people are
an act of
criminals.
violence, perhaps a major contributing factor is that they were mistreated because of their mental disorder. But in this case, essentially what they really found was a correlation that leads to no definitive causation at all, and that people with ASD are not actually violent.